And you can start in 10 seconds.
Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Betsy Bowman, your host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice, el Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering the solidarity economy. We hope to resume our income-generating programs, our trips to Cuba and Chiapas, and a new one to the Puebla network of cooperatives this spring and summer. Check our webpage for details. In the meantime, please donate to the Center for Global Justice, again at our webpage. We depend on your donations in order to be able to pay our Mexican staff. Before introducing Silvia Federici, I want to say that the Center for Global Justice stands with the Russian peoples, as well as the Ukrainian peoples, and all the peoples of the world in opposing the current war. Ukraine has been involved in a civil war since 2014 with neo-Nazi nationalists and other Ukrainians in the Donbass. Neither side is laudable. Both sides are guilty of atrocities, and neutrality for Ukraine is the best solution. We call for an end to the fighting. We call for peace in the region and for neutrality for Ukraine. We also call for an end to the military-industrial complexes worldwide. Ukraine is a huge arms exporter, as well as the US and Russia, and they're the only ones benefiting from this war. We also call for the re-establishment of RT in the United States and Europe. Here in Mexico, we still get RT. Anyway, we stand for peace and an end to the fighting. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce today's speaker, Silvia Federici. Silvia has been pivotal in the women's movement worldwide, starting with the wages for housework movement in the 70s. Silvia has never stopped theorizing the role of women's work in the building of capitalism and society in general. The UN has estimated that women do about 80% of the world's work, from caring for children and elders to getting men ready to go to work, paid work, to farming. About 80% of the world's farmers are women. Silvia's groundbreaking book, Caliban and the Witch, Women, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation, explains how women's unpaid labor made the success of capitalism possible. If capitalists had to pay women for the work they do caring for everyone, they would be bankrupt. It's time we talk of reparations for women. Well, with that thought, I'll give the floor to Professor Federici and her presentation on celebrating women's struggles as we celebrate International Women's Day tomorrow and Women's History Month this month. Thank you, Silvia, for taking the time to share with all of us.
Thank you. Thank you, Betsy, and thank you to you all for inviting me to the center. It's always a pleasure to be with you. And it's a pity that because of COVID and other reason, I've not been able to come back as I've done, in the past many times. But I'm with you, with my soul, my spirit, and I join, your call for peace and against militarization. This new war is a disaster that affects us all. And undoubtedly, women in Ukraine, in Russia, those who are going to pay the highest price. With this in mind, and with in mind, the celebration that are taking place and the commitments that so many women are going to make tomorrow, on this day, so important in the history of women's struggle. I decided to introduce today in my discussion a topic that really unites today, unfortunately, women across the world, which is the question of women and death. Taking the issue of death in the broadest sense, with a question in the background that is being raised by the network that are forming to fight against it, which is who owes to whom. And of course, the point that I'm going to make is that we are creditors, not only women, but certainly women are creditors, are not debtors. And this must be the vision and the strategy, the slogan that animates our struggle, against that and as against all forms of exploitation. So this is the point I'm going to make. And here again, let me add that today that can be considered what Maria Mies defines as a negative commons. It is something that really unites women, unfortunately, from Africa to Asia, and certainly the United States and Latin America. But before I address directly that issue, let me make a few points about what is the origin today of this debt. I have done some research, and especially about Europe and about the US, and I found something very interesting, which is that the women who have the largest amount of debt today, and this is really a large, the majority of working class proletarian women, are those who have some form of income, who have a wage or other form of income, informal, through their work. In other words, today, actually, work does not provide to the majority of women autonomy, financial autonomy, the capacity to sustain themselves, to sustain their family, but actually gets them deeper and deeper into debt. Reason is that despite all the great celebration by the United Nations and neoliberal feminists, in fact, the majority of jobs into which women have entered, are jobs that, in fact, are the most precarious, the most underpaid, in many cases hazardous, and as I mentioned before, are jobs that do not allow them to survive. In fact, women have entered into the wage workforce at the lowest echelon, and in a way that, in fact, makes their position completely precarious. So under this condition, in fact, what we have seen is this very perverse phenomenon, whereby, the jobs becomes the avenue to the loan. The wage, rather than providing some form of sustenance, the wage becomes the condition under which women can actually go to the bank or can go to companies that give loans and acquire some sort of compensation, some sort of complement to the wage that they make. And in fact, in the United States, we have seen that hand in hand with the entrance of women or more women into the wage workforce, the formation of what are called payday loan companies. These are really, sharks, no offense to the animal. but they are really actually predatory organizations who have come into the existence only to basically, further exploit, women's new access to some form of wealth. They provide loans and to a population of women who have no collateral, and therefore they impose interest rate up to 50–60%, which means that a whole chain, a form of enslavement is actually, implemented, because these women will never be able, by their own efforts, to liberate themselves. So payday loan have really become, in a sense, one of the visible element of the fact that, as we have said many times, certainly wage work has not liberated women. It never liberated men, and certainly has not liberated, women. And in fact, we have seen, must be added, that again, starting with the 80s, when with much fanfare by the UN, by the government, and by women organizations too, and not only neoliberal, unfortunately, not only neoliberal. What we have seen is that hand in hand with women entering the wage workforce, or at least the majority, because many have been there, particularly Black women, never were able to rely on a male wage. So Black women always had to have some form of paid employment. But with the expansion of the female workforce, we have seen governments systematically cutting all the welfare services, what little welfare services had been provided in the past. So for example, we have seen that starting with the 1980s, as part of the broader neoliberal agenda, basically services to the non-self-sufficient elderly, daycare center and so on, have been systematically curtailed. So that the very moment the women have access to some income, miserable as that income was, they had to pay the more substantial amount of their resources, to pay for services that in the past were somehow more guaranteed by the state, right? So this is really a very perverse machine. And we have seen, and what the phenomenon that has often been referred to as the financialization of our reproduction. The financialization of our reproduction is a process whereby you now have to pay, not only provide the work, but you now have to pay in order to reproduce yourself. In other words, conditions are so harsh economically, that you need to have financial means, the credit card, etc., the loan from the bank, the loan from the payday, etc., to pay for the everyday expenses of life. The financialization of reproduction, which means that today, the majority of women, again, in the working class and proletarian, those who might not have waged work in the traditional sense, but have other form of informal income, that are exploited really in three ways, right? Not only in terms of housework, domestic work, and poorly paid wage worker, extremely poorly paid wage worker, but they're also exploited because the financial means they need to use, right, the loan, the credit card, etc., it's a further form of exploitation. There is an interest that you have to pay, right? And so there's another way in which women are contributing to the accumulation of wealth, to the capitalist accumulation of wealth, right? So it's a triple form of exploitation. And not surprisingly, and here we can discuss more maybe in the discussion period, but there has been a very, very noticeable effect on women's life, because the burden of the debt is mounting, that basically looms on women's horizon on their back every day, but also on the horizon, because it shapes what the vision or the possibility that they may have in the future or may not have, the curtailing of possibility, right? That the existence, you know, of this death, you know, in a way, you know, basically limits, you know, the sense that they have. And now the level of exploitation, it's really taking place on a more multiple level. And so given this situation, across the world, networks have been forming. And I've been participant of one particular network, you know, to basically bring together women to fight against the death, right? And I want to also add here that I don't want to leave out, because I think it's very important, and particularly in Latin America, which is that adding to the land that can be incurred to through the banks or through the paid loan companies, we have to also mention the question of microcredit. And I know that so much has been written, so much has been said about it, and I will not really go, you know, further into it, because much of it is known. Nevertheless, it has to be said, microcredit too has created, far from giving more resources to a population of women, poor women that presumably were only missing a little bit of money to set themselves up and become prosperous entrepreneurs, that far from doing that, it has created a population of women who are now completely in debt, and they have lost even the little that they had. Because to women who were very much in crisis, impoverished, not poor women, we have to be very careful not to speak of poor women. Poor is a concept that naturalizes poverty. We have to speak of impoverishment. Impoverishment indicates that there's been an action, that something has been done that has deprived, taken away from these women the resources that they have. And in fact, many of the women from Bangladesh to Niger, etc., who had to resort to microcredits, and women who have lost their land, and women who have, because of structural adjustment and other forms of expulsion, other forms of exploitation, have actually been deprived of their traditional resources. So microcredit was supposed to help them being the solution to impoverished women, and in reality has created a situation that is even worse. Because predictably, because when you are in a situation of crisis where everyday life is in danger, you know, a few $100 here and there will not suffer. And in fact, most of the money that women have earned have often taken as a microcredit, has often gone to pay for medicine, to take care of the immediate crisis of life that they have encountered. And then when you don't pay, the interest on the loan increases. And not only that, when you do not pay, you are subjected to all forms of shaming and violence as well. You know, I know, for example, I found that in a number of countries, when women do not pay in Africa, their picture is placed on the door of the banks, right? So that, you know, they are exposed, you know, to general shaming. There are many, many stories from Bangladesh of, you know, people from the companies, the microcredit companies going to their houses, taking away their roofs, taking away their rice pot, which is really the symbol of the woman holding together the family, the community, the rice pot that they use, the symbol of their reproductive function, taking away that, and basically exposed to all kinds of shaming, so that often women have had to leave their villages. Some have killed themselves. Right? And it's very interesting here And by the way, I want to mention a book that if you have not read, and I had it here, now I don't see it, okay. I have the English version, but you can get the Spanish one. The Spanish is called Potencia Feminista by Veronica Gago, who is in Argentina. She is part of one of these network of women who are fighting against the debt. And she has very interesting chapters in this book about what has been happening in Argentina, for instance, right? Where the bolsas familiares that the government has given to the poorest women have been considered equivalent to a wage and have enabled these women to take money out of the banks. But by the same token, have also contributed, right, to create the new forms of indebtment, precisely for the same fundamental reason that a little bit of money is not solving the problems of a population which has been plunged by predatory institutional politics and economics into serious catastrophic forms of misery. And a little few money here and there to be repaid. And of course, with microcredit, the repayment system is quite pernicious, because after you take the loan, every 2 weeks, you have to pay back something. And this is very interesting and very subtle, because it means that in order to pay back every 2 weeks a certain amount of money, you necessarily have to engage in some form of commercial activity. So meaning you cannot use that money, for example, to boost your farming, to boost your agricultural activities, because the timing of agricultural work and agricultural production are not based on weeks, they are based on seasons. This means that actually one hidden intent of microcredit, it's really to force women to relinquish whatever little land they have had access to, and instead divert their activity towards commerce, buying and selling, getting commodities from the companies and then reselling them, etc. So important, I didn't want to forget to mention the question of microcredit, to give a broader vision of what the scope of the debt is. And in fact, of course, to complete this discussion, this part of my discussion is that very clearly in this phase of capitalist accumulation, in this case of capitalist development and organization of new form of exploitation, that as a central strategic place, very central. In fact, we can speak of debt economies and debt politics. Why that is so important? That is very important because, first of all, it's a tremendous form of exploitation. Once you have a debt, then you have to work more. Right? Then your workday is endless. And not only that, we have seen, for instance, in the case of microcredit, that many women have been forced to keep their children, particularly the girls, at home from school to help them, with activities that enable them to pay back their loan, right? So it's a tremendous form of exploitation. At the same time, it is a form of exploitation that, unlike wage labor, separates you rather than uniting you. In wage labor, you recognize workers is a collective process, and therefore you recognize that you are being exploited. You recognize your power, you recognize your contribution. When you are in a debt situation, it's a one-to-one relationship to a company, to a bank, and very often is accompanied by a sense of guilt. Oh, I borrowed too much. I didn't manage the money well. I've had experience of that when years ago I was a part of a movement, student movement, teachers working with students against student debt, which in the United States is rampant. And we began to realize that one of the difficulty of organizing was the sense of guilt that people had, to the point that at the moment of organizing, often one tactic was to ask people to say loud what they owed to the bank, because there was so much shame, so much sense of having failed. So the debt, I call it an communalism measure, is a measure that breaks down the commons. Is a measure that breaks down the commons. It singles out the person, the debtor. She has not paid, right, to the shame of the community. She's a person who does not respect her obligation. In the case of microcredit, this is very perverse because the loans are usually given to a group. And if one woman does not pay, the others have to pay, which means very soon what used to be a cohesive group becomes a group of women who are suspicious of each other and are beginning to check on each other's life because they realize that if one, for example, does not pay, it will be an extra burden for themselves. So it's a very perverse and effective mechanism because it obtains the same degree and intensity of exploitation, but at the same time, it undermines the capacity that people have to unite and to basically struggle against it. Right? This being the situation and coming to the realization that in fact, and this I think is across the board, those who have the largest amount of debt is women, in the United States, particularly Black women. Black women have, as far as healthcare, student, credit card, they have the largest amount of that because, of course, they come from the most impoverished community. So, and keeping in mind, that this, in fact, has a tremendous effect on women's life. Already, again, I quote from the US, but I imagine that this is a reality that goes beyond the US. Women's life expectancy has begun to decline, hand in hand with the major entries in wage work, increased amount of work because housework has not ended. So that now women are working on so many fronts. Together with that, the anxiety about money, the anxiety about the debt, the extra engagement, extra work, the pain that that involves is having a direct effect on women's life. In the United States, I've discovered that some doctors now speak of the money sickness. It's a sickness for which they only can find one cause, anxiety about money. So they speak about money sickness, anxiety about money, the new disease. And there's a particular in women who are suffering with it. So keeping all this in mind, right, as I said before, there's been a broad, attempt to form networks, right, to make the debt one of those issues, not the only one, but one of those issues. And all these issues are connected. It is the women who have a lot of debt. Women who have a lot of debt are more exposed to violence. So there is also a factor of increased amount of violence the women are experiencing families, when they carry a lot of debt. The devaluation the women have historically suffered has actually multiplied, intensified, by the presence of debt. So keeping that in mind, there's been already for a number of years. And as I mentioned, I've been in contact with women in Argentina. In fact, this year, discussing with women in Argentina from Ni Una Menos, what kind of issues we were going to, put on the table for International Women's Day, right? What were the most pressing? You know, of course, there was the question of health, you know, what COVID and the collapse of the sanitary system has revealed, right? And the struggle of the nurses, major, major issue. Probably many nurses have that up to their neck. But also the question of that, right? But there is a network that has been formed, and here, and this will be the second part of my discussion, some very interesting strategies have been used by women in Europe, and particularly in Belgium, where there is a large network of women and men who have been fighting against this issue, against that, and particularly have been denouncing all those forms of debt that have also been acquired illegitimately with fraud, direct, open fraud. So what women did a few years ago, and which I think is very inspirational in a broader way, is they decided that one of the steps they would take would be to organize, to present the government of Europe with a bill, la factura. No, la factura is to say, okay, let's see what is the women are doing and have been doing, for which they have never been paid. And when we see that, and when we count, and they actually even began to have interviews in the streets with women saying, what is your life like? What is that you do? What is your work? And collecting them, and then with the idea of presenting the bill, right? And that strategy is a strategy that is really intended to completely turn the discourse over that upside down. And of course, upside down to say, we are the creditors. We are the creditor. You owe us. The idea that the women of the world are in debt with the governments of the world, are in debt to the state and capital is a scandal. It's a lie. It's a fraud. Because actually generation and generation of women have actually worked, given, and been taken, their labor has been extracted and has benefited far more than their own families and themselves, has benefited all the employers of the world, because their labor has never been really reproduction for prosperity and happiness and a better life, but it's been labor that has been directed to the reproduction of the workforce, to make sure that all employers, you know, could have everyday workers who were properly reproduced and whose energy could be properly intensely exploited, you know, for the sake of accumulation. And in addition to the workers for the factory, for the offices, and for other activities, women have provided a workforce, unfortunately, for the armies and for every activity that capitalism has thrived upon. And despite that, all their work has been completely naturalized, made invisible, never remunerated, has never entitled women, for example, to have any form of subsidy, access to pension. For example, in the United States, women have access to pension, Social Security, through their husband after 7 or 8 years of marriage. And if there's a divorce, they lose, of course, all of that, right? So there is this amount, the history of women is the history of this immense amount of unpaid labor that women have provided, you know, reproducing daily, and, you know, who, with a life organized with the same rhythm of the factories and their offices in which their husband worked, you know, often, you know, suffering the same diseases, you know, that their husbands suffer, because their activities were so very much on a continuum with the activities that these men perform. For example, wives of miners cleaning the uniforms in the mines of Virginia or in the mines of South Africa and gaining black lungs and dying of black lungs. Women have died of the same diseases that their husband have, brought home. So this situation, has now increasingly been taken on and, used to, in fact, wage a struggle against this new form of death and basically reverse the situation and tell the government that no, we don't have any death, because actually across the world, we have been the ones who have done work and work and work and work in a way without receiving any forms of compensation. And on the contrary, working in ways that have made us dependent on men, dependent on wage work and on the wage workers, and vulnerable, to what the dependence implies, which has been vulnerable in many cases to domestic violence. Due to it, you cannot leave a family, you cannot leave a home, an abusive husband, if you're dependent on that person economically, particularly when you have younger children. So this, in a way, is a situation, is a strategy that is beginning to unfold. And we are looking forward. And when I speak of we, I speak not only of the particular network I'm involved with, but I think a lot of women that over the years, feminists in different countries that are spoken with, that over the years have increasingly brought the issue of death at the center of feminist discourse, at the center of feminist organizing, and because, they have seen that from the point of view of the capitalist class, the exploitation of women is infinite. And I think that the recent events, the existence, the development of COVID has demonstrated once more this reality, because it has shown that in fact there is this wave, this tendency in capitalism to basically, burden women with more and more tasks. COVID has made visible what before was taking place, but often hidden by this appearance of women made new independence. And in reality, COVID has shown not only the vulnerability of that independence, but it also shown that in fact there's been, beneath the facade of independence, there's been actually an accumulation of labor that has been put on the shoulders of women. And so that they found themselves to be doing more and more housework, taking care of the children, taking care of everybody's emotional need, all along doing perhaps telework, all along having to worry about providing security, providing sanitation, sanitary measures, etc., etc. And we can say that today, women are living in a state of real crisis. There is a majority of women who do not have independent means, who do not, benefit from capitalism, either because they have independent means or because they are struggling to have activities that enable them to exploit other people. Otherwise, it's a situation of crisis because, we are in a state in which rather than investing in social reproduction, at every new turn, the state is undermining that investment. And now we see in the US, no sooner, we have this democratic government that is supposed to be more sensitive to people's need, that the military budget has gone up. And we can see now billions and billions are added to the already obscenely immense military budget, that existed. And this once again has proven what women have recognized, looking at their own experience, that in this society, if you produce to kill, if you produce weapon, if you work to produce death, you are a productive worker. But if you produce for life, if you are a mother, if you are somebody, a farmer, etc., you're not really seen as productive. And I think looking forward to this International Women's Day and what it means in terms of struggle, I will conclude this presentation say, we have to reverse that. We have to reverse that. Keeping in mind that as domestic workers in Spain say, without us, nothing moves. Without us, nothing moves. And we have to reverse because this is not a world worth living, a world in which the production of death takes priority over the production of life is not a world worth living. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Silvia. I, of course, didn't realize when I ended my talk, my introduction of you saying that we need to demand reparations for women, that you would make an entire presentation about women and debt. And that just underlines the idea that like African Americans who are deserving of reparations for all the past work they've done that they weren't paid for, well, women are also deserving of reparations, and they find themselves further in debt, as do African Americans, Hispanics. Anyway.
Yes, Betsy, I'd like to add that what I said about women, we are the creditor, and it's a scandal that we have been defined as debtors. Applies even more, for example, to Black Americans, to all those the capitalism has enslaved. Applies even more to all the population that have been colonized.
Of course.
The idea of an African debt is an incredible scandal. The Africans should owe to the International Monetary Fund or to any monetary system after they are depleted of human beings and wealth. It's mind-boggling. Shame on us, shame on that we have not been able to build a struggle that is really fighting against that enables the scandal to continue.
Cliff, do you want to add a comment?
There's a hand there.
Oh, I didn't see it. I can't.
Let me just say that for those who are watching this on YouTube, if you have a question, you can get that to us by sending an email to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com, and we'll pass your question or comment on to Silvia here in the Zoom room.
Yeah, meanwhile, if you want to tell me.
Yes, hi, Silvia. That was really great. When I came into the RPA 25 years ago, you were already causing quite a furor with your anti-prison work and your anti-death penalty work with J. Everett Green. And it is so good to see you that now, after 25 years, you still have the fire and the passion and are still fighting for the dignity of human beings. I just want to make one tell one quick story. In 1984, 1985, I moved to San Miguel de Allende, Chorro 54, and lived for about a year with my family. And in order to get the house, we had to take a maid. Her name was Rufina. They, having been the progeny of Black slaves who did this unpaid housework and labor, I did not want the maid, but they would not rent me the house without the maid. She was paid per contract in the house 500 pesos per month. And so I thought that was woefully inadequate for the work she did. She worked every day, tirelessly feeding us lunch. She never took a break. I'd say, don't fold my clothes. She worked anyway. So I decided to raise her salary, double it to 1,000 pesos a month. And it almost caused a revolution in San Miguel de Allende, because when the other maids heard that she was making more money, they wanted more money. And the expatriate Americans who lived there suddenly were saying, what are you doing? But I never saw myself as a capitalist exploiter. Being a Black man in America, I had always felt it was counter-revolutionary to be financially successful in a system that oppressed other people, because then I would become an oppressor. And so I wanted to help this woman with her kids, et cetera, et cetera. And so this idea you have of a negative commons, I think, as you so eloquently said, most Black people in America simpatico to the struggle of women, because Black Americans too are part of that negative commons. And on this Women's Day tomorrow, I wish you all the best, continued health and revolution, for the people. Thank you.
Thank you, my brother. Thank you very much. And yeah, absolutely. We still have, slavery as change form has never been completely abolished. And since the proclamation of emancipation, actually forms of enslavement have continuously been restructured, but it's never really ended. And we're still dealing with that in so many ways. And clearly, indebtment today is really one of them. And then connects is on a continuous, with the ability to enforce, right? Completely enslaving form of work, because when you have the debt, you're not in the position to be a chooser, right? So it all comes together. One form of slavery enable another.
I'm sure there are other comments, questions, reflections. It's yeah, Peggy.
Thank you, Betsy. Sylvia, I am so inspired by listening to you. I am each time. I can't wait to get involved in some way with this project of La Factura, and I'm going to follow up with you on that. I have a question for you. Do you know Ivan Illich's publication Gender came out in 1980 out of Cuernavaca? Well, I don't know if you remember, the response to that was so heated on the part of feminist communities. But my read of that book is that he's saying the same thing you're saying today. That when women entered the paid labor force, sexism was born. That's his thesis. We could argue that at multiple levels, of course. But the real point was that when women were not wage earners, women actually had more autonomy, more personal power. And, I think that a lot of the response to that was the rejection of domesticity a long time ago.
Yeah, it's a very complicated question.
It is.
Right?
I just wanted to share that came to me.
Yeah. Well, you see, what I would say, right, there are many things to say. There are really many things to say, right, is that For sure, today, many women have so much work on their hands, having to do still most of the housework, care of the children, care of the elderly, care of the sick, etc., etc. Then a job, they have no time, very difficult to have time for any struggle. And the amount of services available, it's pitiful. Even in the so-called richest country of the world, even with people who have some form of security and insurance, and I can speak from personal experience. I can speak volume because I've gone through. But so that said, one can say that, yeah, there was much more possibilities. Also, we should add that when women have a job outside the home, and we saw it very early, there's been a way of fragmentation, that the women's movement was a movement of women who had a common ground. You can say, yeah, that it was not sensitive enough to the situation of Black women, but there was a sense of women that had to do really with the question of reproduction, sexuality, etc., right? The moment you have a job outside the home, then you're fighting in the company, you're fighting in the factory, you're fighting, etc. So there's been a moment of the women were not present in the community any longer. That said, right, I really hesitate and not go the road of saying, no, it was not acceptable, it was not right that women fought to have jobs outside the home. I think that the third caveat in that regard, was that very often the kind of jobs that have been celebrated as being more creative, better paid, giving more autonomy, are jobs that imply the disciplining of other people, right? So for example, I and other women for a long time, have been, very, very, very aware and critical of the celebration that we often heard of certain kind of jobs. The social worker, for example, is better than, cleaning the streets or working in a laundromat. But if you are a social worker, what is your job? It's dealing with the crisis that women have in their family. It's telling them to go home. Hey, honey, take it easy, go home, look at your son, blah, blah, etc. So there's a lot of work that is actually really doing the work of the state. And we have to be very aware of that when we think about, emancipation through work, right? Certainly, capitalist work is exploitation, it's never emancipated anybody. But in addition, emancipation through work, what kind of work? Is work that puts you together with other people and you can, or is also work that teaches you that, it's like being a cop. It's like being a policeman. There are many ways of being a policeman. You don't only have to wear a uniform to be a policewoman. So I think that the idea of celebrating this emancipation, we have to be very careful. I wouldn't want to go the other road to say, oh, that's okay, because that dependency, if you don't have an income of your own, you're dependent on another person, right? Then you're dependent, then you are in a struggle against people you love. And your dependence on that person makes that person more dependent on capital. So it's the man who is in a struggle, but says, oh my God, I have a wife at home and children. So that dependence multiplies. The dependence of the wife and the children becomes the dependence of the man, which is why I was very surprised. The man didn't support the feminist movement. Because actually having dependence, as you write, on your, it's not an ideal situation. So to me, the main problem with the feminist movement was that as they were struggling to break the dependence on the male wage, which implies that the male wage could be used to discipline them, implies that the man had the power through the wage, the power of the state to discipline women. The wage was the channel, the tool, the instrument to discipline women, because you bring the wage home, the house has to be clean, the children have to be this and this. The problem to me in fighting against that dependence, women did not fight, against the unpaid labor that is reproductive work, right? When we struggle for wages for household, I cannot tell you how much we heard. We were institutionalizing women in the home. We were bringing money in this idyllic area, etc., etc. Meanwhile, there was a movement of women, mostly Black women, the welfare mothers, who were saying this money, which we are fighting for, is giving us the possibility of not taking any job that comes along, not staying with a man who is abusing us, having a space, a breathing space from which we can build something. And more important for us, for instance, wages for household was never, the end of the road, was never the revolution, was a strategy, was a way of making visible the invisible, right? Not because the idea that wage labor liberates you or wages for household liberates you. But, today I'm also very, very interested in the question of how to the reorganization. I still believe that women must struggle to reclaim the wealth that the state and capital has taken away from us, whether it is land, woods, waters, assets, money, but reclaim their wealth so that it can be put at the service of our reproduction. I think that this is one of the most important struggles on earth, to take away the wealth the state had taken away from people and place it. This to me is the feminist struggle. The feminist struggle is the relocation of wealth, not redistribution, is relocation, is reappropriation of wealth, number one. And on that basis, the reorganization of reproduction on a collective basis, on a more collective basis. How both are done is not something that anybody like me can say. This has to be the product of a struggle. And is a product, in chapters, it will take certain forms. In Africa, in Nigeria, in the Delta or in a fisherman community, it will take. Obviously, there are different historical, like the Zapatistas say, one no, many yeses. One no, no to exploitation. What kind of society we want to build? No to injustice, no to inequality, no to impoverishment. What kind of vision we have of the good society, el buen vivir, which now is only on paper. What vision we have of the buen vivir has to be articulated on the basis of our history, of our struggle, geographies, culture. There's not one history. There are many historical trajectories, right? But I think that these two levels, which can never be separated in my view, because we don't want to redistribute poverty. We don't want to recreate the commons on the basis of poverty. So the capitalism has all the power, all the lands, all the forests, and we redistribute our poverty communally. So the two struggle, which again, that's the challenge to me in the world today. The reclaiming of the wealth and the reorganization of reproduction in a more communal, collective way, right? So that, we don't face the issue of reproduction individually. This whole idea of the private life this law, this fraud, which is the private life, because it's a fraud. The state enters our life at all points. The state enters our life when they want. The state control, particularly for women. They have controlled our uterus, our sexuality, our procreation. What private life? What private life do we have? But, you know, so I think that this to me is where the struggle is.
We have several more hands up. First, someone named Pat, and then Norma, and then Marcos. Maybe you could all three put your questions to Silvia and she could speak to all of them.
Okay. So that.
My
Pat?
name is YH Pat, and the question is
Sorry.
about your experience in reframing what has been naturalized in talking about the impoverishment of people rather than the poor. And if you can give examples of places or cultures where that has worked or at different levels, because I find that the most important move. Thank you.
And then we can answer the other one.
Norma, are you ready with your question? We're going to take several questions and then let
Yes, I
Silvia.
heard you. I heard you. I was going to, actually, I had this nice story to tell out of Who's Counting. I posted the link to that 30-year-old presentation about Marilyn Waring, who became this young and female. Pardon? Oh, you know about it, right? And she tells about going to very many places around the world to find out about what was going on to women exactly in the context that you were talking about. And she got to a place in Africa where the people in the group, in the tribe, were sitting around and talking about their lives. And she asked the women what they did. And they said they started at 4 in the morning, and then they described the day and detail after detail until 11 o'clock that night. And then she turned to the men sitting around, kind of bending down, you know, and kneeling, and asked them what they did. And they looked at each other. We tell the women what to do. It was so, I mean, they learned it well, however they picked that up. I don't know how isolated they were. Maybe they got it from the American capitalists who tell us all what to do, who own us, our owners. You mentioned an interesting relationship that to me is very central to the things I do. I run for school board every year, every time it's on the ballot, to talk about things like that. The teachers are the cops. For one thing, they're the babysitters. And the next thing is they're there to tell the child, no, you're not doing it right. Do it this way, regardless that the child may be presenting good things. The compulsory classroom, called compulsory free education. A 14-year-old child named that for me. It's neat. It is an onus for people. People hate it. They say, how do you like school? Oh, I love it. You know, they're told that they have to say something nice. They don't like it. None of us likes it. We spend our lives like getting over Catholicism. We spend our lives getting over having had to go to what's called public education that Einstein so commented on. I'm surprised any ideas survive what's called public education. And I'm a communist. I'm a deep communist, and I'm all for us providing everything for us all, right? So it's not that I don't want us all, and I'm not saying anything against learning. I think learning happens from the time you're in the womb to your whole life, and it's disregarded. It doesn't get diplomas a lot. So that relationship of policing ourselves via these institutions called the police that we need the police to help take care of ourselves. there were a few other things. By the way, I needed to comment that your work, while it's not matchless, and many people are doing it, fortunately, I was looking through the list, you know, as I was getting the websites to post on the chat. And there's a lot of people doing what you're doing, but your work is stellar. And I enjoyed it tremendously. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you, Norma. Marcos.
Well, first, thank you so much for your talk. I am most interested, given your analysis, hearing more about strategies for resistance, and particularly strategies that are gaining traction. Because I think the problem has been laid out for us very nicely. And so the question is, what is to be done?
Okay, well, you know, all these, you know, there are many people working on this issue. And I want to say that the struggle to denaturalize language, I think, is a very, very important struggle. You know, not only impoverishment, but there's a whole language. We have to be very, very attentive to the institutional language, that it's completely geared to hide, you know, the causes, you know, of the reality, and to present a world of misery and poverty, which then presents, you know, the institution, the government, the very actors, the very agent responsible for the impoverishment. It enables them to be in the position of the helpers. So we are going to help poverty. We are going to help the war on poverty, for example. Johnson celebrated for the war on poverty. Here in a society in which the American government has, you know, enslaved, condoned all the forms of racism. So I think that is very important, this question of the denaturalizing, right? And so poverty. What is poverty? How it happens? Africa, a poor continent. You know, Churchill said that Africa is a scandal because it was so rich in all the basic mineral and, you know, from the point of view of nature and so on. And, you know, this is one thing that of Churchill has remained impressed. The scandal was, Africa was a scandal because of its wealth, right? And now it has been depicted as the poor continent, right? The poor continent. So I think it's, that's the question. We really always need to bring out the causes, because in doing that, then you see the resistance, right? I mean, just anticipating some of my thoughts. I mean, in that is the possibility then of understanding what are the forms of resistance, because none of this problem is separable from others. That, the issue of that is not separable from the issue of the exploitation of wage work, you know, from the issue of the expropriation, the ongoing primitive accumulation, the ongoing expropriation of a large part of the world, you know, from the most basic means of reproduction, which is what globalization has been. The expansion of capitalist relations is like a vacuum cleaner. It's like this expanding monster and vacuum cleaner that is sucking up. Extractivism is now the name increasingly used. For example, interesting the way extractivism is now used, right? It's not used only to describe mining activity or activity or extract things from the soil. Extractivism in the language of many social movements is now being used to describe what capital exploitation it is, how it extracts from people's life all the juices of the earth and the juices of our body, of our mind, of our relationship, right? So I think that it's very important to bring out the causes and to see this issue as multidimensional. We cannot fix the issue of that unless we deal with the issue of the organization of work, unless we put an end to the processes of dispossession, that means that the struggle against has to be a struggle for, has to be a struggle to construct. And this maybe I come to your question. What are the forms of resistance, right? The forms of resistance, first of all, are forms that not only oppose the activity of capital state, the policemen of the world, etc., but also construct on a day-to-day basis, also construct the elements of the society that we want to live, in which we want to bring into the world. And I think that this is here why the struggle that women internationally are making on a day-to-day basis are so important. I've been very inspired, to tell you the truth. What are the forms of resistance? I mentioned the networks that are forming around that. There's a big mobilization around that, right? A big mobilization, not new, right? The struggle against that, and I'm not talking about Graeber and 5,000 years ago. I'm talking about the last 50 years, right? The first struggle that I knew of was from Mexico, El Barzón. Remember El Barzón? El Barzón was a we learned a lot. We studied El Barzón in New York. El Barzón is the yoke in Spanish that, animals have on their shoulder when they go to the fields. And is a symbol in the 1930, El Barzón in Mexico was a symbol of slavery. It was taken as a symbol of slavery. El Barzón was a movement in the 90s that basically fought against that, and they were very powerful. In 2000, women in Bolivia, occupied a government building and occupied centers of banks, occupied, together with indigenous women, to fight against indictment, right? There were massive demonstrations where people pulled out their pocket, out of their pants. So this struggle has been going on. Now, across the US, there is a student struggle, not only against the debt, but also for free university. It's not enough to say no to the debt. We have to say yes to condition of living in which indebtment becomes impossible. Yes to condition of living. And this means two things. This means to organize movements, connecting movements, finding common grounds, ecological, labor, feminist. They are actually fighting the same cause under different circumstances, right? Organizing to change the institutional, to change the economic form. And at the same time, reorganizing reproduction in a way that it supports our struggle. So these days, I always say, feminists should fight so the reproduction reproduces our struggle rather than reproducing labor power and a capitalist workforce. That the measure of our success is to what extent the energy, the time, the resources that we have, that we engaged, are devoted to reproducing the struggle that we make, to creating connection between us, to creating new forms of commoning of the way we reproduce our life. Las olas populares, Latin America has been very inspirational for me. Going to the favelas in Brazil or going to the favelas in Argentina, La Villa 31, those that they call La Villa Miseria. Actually, I've been very inspired by La Villa Miseria because seeing people who were thrown out from a rural area and they had to invent, take over land, build houses, build streets, all through collective labor. I don't want to romanticize. There are very terrible things that have been happening, with the intervention of narco-traffickers and so intervention of the church. But nevertheless, also very powerful things have occurred by people who realize that it's only by coming together that we can survive, that we don't have any option. But guess what? I think this is true for all of us, or many of us. It's true for a large majority of the world population when we look at it in a broad context. So it seems to me that this issue of death, I stressed it because it's an issue that expands. When you expand it, you go the more exploitation of labor, more violence for women, more, you see, you touch the whole. It's one of those issues that enables you to touch the whole, to understand the new form of capitalist accumulation, and then to understand how do we fight, right? As I said, on those two levels, right? Try to change the broader macro system, but also the day-to-day, communal, local, so that there is a sustenance, so we don't have big moment of struggle and then everything disappears for 10, 20, 30 years, right? But actually that we build, we transform the relations among us, right? I think that's very, very important. And the question of education is crucial. Education is crucial. And to me, one of the forms of commoning, of creating new communal structure, is also creating spaces, intermediary, between the neighborhood and the state and the institution. Spaces where nurses who work in the hospital come together with people in the community, as they often have, but that has to be amplified. Spaces where teachers come together, because now the logic is a logic of division, right? The government or the school system tells the parent, oh, your child is learning nothing because the teachers, they're only thinking of money. Oh, those teachers. And then what? The parents are working 24 hours a day. They don't have time to go talk. So again, the issue of schooling, it's a multidimensional. It's connected with the issue of labor. You work 24 hours, you cannot have a voice in the community. You cannot have a voice about the school system or about the health system. So we need to liberate time. So there is a struggle that needs to liberate time so that we can actually be present and not be expropriated of our decision-making. So we need to recuperate the health, and we need to recuperate our decision-making power. This, to me, is the struggle. And this, I think, what should be, well, what I think I see happening, in many of the discussions that I've prepared for this International Women's Day, which is a day. International Women's Day is only a moment. What counts is that it gives us the possibility to broaden the conversation among us and to broaden our connections.
We have to have the kind of availability of children to accompany those nurses in open service clinics, clinics where people go back and forth and are part of the community when they're sick and being nursed, a whole other perspective, and the children learn because they're part and they're not segregated.
Right. That's right. Segregation. Yeah, segregation is one of the principles. The nurses have been fantastic. The nurses have been a very important voice in many different places.
Age segregation.
Yeah.
Not necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Cliff, do you have some questions from the YouTube audience?
Yes, we do. We have 3 questions that have come in.
Mm-hmm.
Let me screen share them for you all to see. The first comes from philosopher Doug Morris. He says, incredible presentation, Silvia. Thanks. Hoping this question is not too big.
Mm-hmm.
Can you please address how women will be bearing much of the burden of ongoing and accelerating climate disaster, and how that connects to the various debts women continue to pay under the exploitative regime of capital.
Hmm.
The
Yeah.
second question we have comes from Joanne Pilardi in Baltimore. Thanks so much for your insight, Silvia. An international women's organization of our international women's organizations of any help at all regarding the debt and women. For example, Women to Women International, or do they make it worse? Or the UN? Any comments on these liberal organizations?
Hmm.
And the third question comes from Canada, from Sheila Reed. She asks, is there any country in the world where women are not so exploited, including not being victims of debt? Thanks so much for much valuable information.
Okay, so I'll do my best. These are all very, very broad questions. And I want to say that some of them, some of these questions, I can probably also answer them better, in the longer term, because what I'm discussing is something that is in progress also. We are working on this issue, right? And I could direct some of these questions also to some of other people or some literature that so the question of climate, yeah, of course. I think it was very important here one could speak a day, but just very briefly, I think it was very important when in the 1980s, right, you begin to see the development of the feminist discussion of reproduction, merging with what was the developing ecological movement. And so you have the beginning of ecofeminism. Ecofeminism, I think, at first, was more theoretical, but I think more and more, ecofeminism has become a politics, for example, of indigenous women organization, campesina women's organization, right, who are fighting, in the Amazonia, for instance, the Ecuadorian and Brazilian Amazonia, lots of women organizations connecting the question of, like MST, for example, connecting the issue of the appropriation of land, with the issue of the fight against mining, the fight against the pollution of rivers, right? For example, gold mining and so on with arsenic. So there is now a popular feminist indigenous campesina movement, very strong in Latin America, very strong, and not only in Latin America. There are movements in the United States, right? Also fighting against the pollution of the lakes, fighting for a different kind of agriculture. This is where the issue of reproduction and the issue of independence from the market, that implies a dependence on monetary system, implies a dependence on the market. And I think part of the feminist cause today, largely because feminism is global, is not only limited to a few urban, European or American enclaves, but is now a global feminism, is a popular feminism that it comes from women who have a long indigenous campesina tradition. Because of that, there is, the understanding that autonomy from the market, whether it is in terms of health, whether it is in terms of food, whether it is also in terms of education, right? Taking away this fundamental life-giving support system from the market, from monetary, from exploitation is crucial. I think this is happening. And I think that that's where the question of climate also comes in. Because the moment you see that, then you know that the exploitation of the land for fossil fuel, for petroleum, et cetera, has to end, right? So that to me is the connection. The struggle, to defend against global warming, etc., etc. It's not separate, from the struggle from food that does not poison our bodies. And I think the women are very central in that. In many cases, they are those who are leading the struggle against these companies that are coming to chew up the lands and to poison the communities. The second one was the question of that, and if the United Nations or other liberal feminist organizations are helping with that. No, I wouldn't go to the United Nations. No, absolutely not. I mean, look what the United Nations has done for the so-called African debt or Latin America. Look what the United Nations is doing now. What's happening in Argentina? Argentina is now signing a deal with the International Monetary Fund, which is going to destroy, unless there is a tremendous amount of struggle, is going to create such level of impoverishment. Women tell me that already, they say to me, I haven't been there in 2 years, Silvia, already begin to see a difference already in the street. You already begin to see. And what have they done? The so-called African debt, which was illegitimate to begin with, which was artificially created, which was a means of recolonization, right? Yeah, that has grown, has not diminished, despite the fact that billions and billions and billions have been paid in interest. That debt has generally grown. They've done a few acts of forgiveness, forgive the poorest country, never without strings attached. So no, I would not put my hope in this organization, which fundamentally are forwarding, international capitalist interests, which doesn't mean that they are not a ground of struggle too. Doesn't mean that you don't push them to do certain things. But I think that you don't rely on them to actually take, because there is a record. We have seen a record as what they have done over the last 3 or 4 decades, with the terrible form of indebtment that the so-called debt crisis have produced. And the victims, the last question, I'm not sure that I remember the last question. Can you tell me, Cliff? I cannot hear you.
Yeah, mute.
Let me look for it again.
It was from Canada. It was about that.
Yeah.
They getting connected with organizations.
Is there any country in the world where women are not so exploited?
Well, I imagine there's probably less in Cuba than in other places, but I don't know. I think when you look at worldwide, the general picture, capitalism now is really, it began with a global vision, right, as a world system, and now has reached really the limits of the world. I don't know if there's any particular place that is able to escape the tentacles of the International Monetary or institution, right? But by and large, all the major countries are in fact, under the system, yeah. So, including Russia and Ukraine, both of them. Okay, is there any other questions?
Other questions, other comments? Yeah.
Could I remind everyone, especially Silvia, of the World Social Forum that will take place in Mexico here, May 1 to 6. All these questions are global questions, and especially peace and that's a good place to get our minds together and begin a new global struggle for the liberation of women, for abolishing debt, and for world peace.
Very good. Very good.
Well, I'd like to say something if, you can stop me if somebody else has something else to say that hasn't talked. Soviet Union Russia did not invade Ukraine. They went in to take care of a particular problem, as you know, the murder by Ukrainians of Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine, the Nazis murdering them, the separatist movement for the past 8 years, and also against the 100+ years attack on the Bolshevik Revolution, the insult, the force to withdraw from standing up for the principle that was so hard fought, especially by World War II, that slaughtered or that caused the horrification of monstrous numbers of people. I mean, and it was participated in by, for one, the United States and the Western powers, that there's been a constant attack on what has been the Soviet Union and is now left in Russia. People are saying, well, Putin's not a socialist. I don't care. The people are socialists. They got left with the ability, with the knowledge to know that they can create the kind of structure that will serve them all.
Thank you, Norma, for that comment. I know that we're all thinking about the war between Ukraine and Russia, and the amount of propaganda coming out of the West and the corporate media is staggering. It reminds me of 9/11 and the amount of propaganda that came out at that time, and the lack of any kind of historical context and any understanding of the 8-year-long civil war that has been waged in Ukraine. But that's a topic for another day and for others who are
just one half of another phrase. The U.S. advertising is a weapon of armament. They just can conquer your mind.
Yeah, exactly. We need another global peace movement and a global demonstration like February 15th, 2003, to oppose this war, to oppose all the military industrial complexes on the planet, to oppose the expenditure of all of the surplus of society on death, on killing machines. And I think Silvia helps us to think about that in other less obvious ways. The killing machine takes many forms, but it's everywhere. With that, maybe, thank you, Silvia. Thank you so much for presenting your new ideas today. I will be thinking about the negative commons. We think of negative totalizers like wars, and a war field is a negative commons. Thank you very much, Silvia, and I hope you're well and in New York and doing well, and we'll be in touch.
Very much. Hugs
Thank
to
you
you
very
all
much.
and all the best. And yes, bye.
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 Bye, Cliff. Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye to everyone. Oh, next week. Next week we can talk about Russia and Ukraine.